I want to talk now about just some of the common reports that you get automatically with Query Store. Now, I've been having queries running against this thing for a while, so we should have some interesting data to be able to pull back. Once Query Store is on, though, you'll see that it does show up here as an option in the database in the Object Explorer window. And if you open that up, you'll actually see what these different reports are. Regressed queries, overall resource consumption, top resource consuming, queries with force plans, queries with high variation, query weight statistics, again in 2017 or higher, and then tracked queries, which we can then actually track specific queries. So on our regressed queries, this is kind of an interesting aspect of, this is just double clicking, bringing this up. Couple things to really note on any of these reports in this top section, this top bar up here. And unfortunately, I don't have a tool with me that I have ready to highlight things. But if you take a look right up here, it'll say top 25 regressed queries for database wide world importers, time period last hour. So what this is going to tell me real quick is that it's going to default to just the last hour. But the good news is we can also change that. Within this top area, we also have a couple different buttons: portrait view, landscape view, the configuration button. And that configuration button is where we can assign, do we want to do more? Do we want to go to the last 12 hours, day, 2 days, week, 2 months? Custom, if you want to dive into a specific date and time range, which can be really useful on, specifically on some of the other reports on, hey, what happened at a specific time? But if we just keep it in the last hour for this one, we have different slicers, duration, CPU, logical reads, writes, physical reads, all these different options in here, CLR time, degrees of parallelism, memory consumption. We've got all this stuff that's just being piped in from our queries running into Query Store. Once we have our selected on our configuration, we've got probably where I'd say is a good starting point for looking at any of your Query Store. It's a great graphical way to just kind of see what's going on. Again, here's our metric. We selected duration. You don't always have to go into the configuration option. We can go ahead and just change that here based on what we want to look at. Logical reads, duration, CPU. And again, this is in regressed queries. So this is telling me that we've had queries, and this is a single query, a single query ID. This one is 47507 that has had over the last period that we're looking at over, the last week. In the last hour, it says that we've had some regression where we've had very different performance. So at one point we had, as we hover over each of these areas, it's gone from an average logical reads of 16. And sometimes we have an average logical read of, oh my gosh, that's a big number. We can then start tracking and seeing what happened, what changed, what were, maybe it wasn't something necessarily with our query. Maybe our data changed. Maybe an index was added. Maybe you name it, something could have changed on it. Could also let you know, maybe it's one you need to tune. And so as we take a look, again, we've got the top left, we've got, this nice bar graph. We can hover over, take a look at some of the values. And man, it's really hard on some of these itty bitty bar graphs to see what's going on. So I'd recommend, this is the chart form. We also have the grid format. And so this gives us a little bit of a better understanding. You can kind of see what was the object name. You can sort by them. We can sort by the queries. Any one of these things, options can be sorted by. And we can take a look at how this looks at in regression perspectives. I like using this one if we've just done a maintenance. Maybe we've changed maintenance. Maybe we've gone from not doing statistics to doing statistics updates more frequently. Maybe we've just added some a compatibility mode change. Maybe we've just moved servers, or maybe we did a software upgrade. This would be a great thing to say. And, hey, we just did the software upgrade in the last hour. what's changed? What's regressed in that time period? And are these levels acceptable? Also, in addition, each of these axes, additional logical reads, we can change these as well to logical read, total logical reads recent. This is just additional. So we can actually look at, different slicers of what's happened. And so we can do that on the X and Y axis and look at that in a lot of different ways. So that's regressed queries. I want to talk now over kind of the overall resource consumption. And this breaks it down, as we can see, overall resource consumption for database worldwide last hour. And we can see, based on execution counts, duration, CPU, logical reads. Well, let's see kind of how maybe this looked over the last 2 days. That's when I was doing stuff. And we can see that over the last 2 days, these are where our execution counts have been. We've had some time periods of almost 300 million executions of queries. And my laptop was screaming last night, I'll tell you. My wife thought it was going to fly away because that fan was burning so hard. We can take a look at durations. These are great ways to also find baselines. So if you've run an entire workload against something and you're like, okay, this is what we should be expecting. We haven't had anybody calling and complaining about execution or performance or anything. So this would be a good baseline. You can grab and look at a lot of these metrics of where your resource utilization is. And when you get another period, you can then use that and say, well, now how did that compare to our baseline? Any one of these metrics can then be you can dive into. So I can say, well, let's say this period of CPU time, I want to dive into that. It's going to take a second to open up. And it's going to be able to give us more in-depth of what were the queries that were running during that period of time. Using these queries in this regard of with the common reports allows us to, again, we can see the utilization of each of these resources, duration runs, execution counts. Maybe we implemented something and our execution counts go way up and we found that, oh my gosh, there was a scalar function and a where clause and execution counts just jumped up. And so you can use that as a quick guide to getting into seeing what's going on. All right. Let me just go on to the next one at this point. So I love using this report. This is probably one of my favorite reports, which is the top resource consuming, because this gives me a great way to slice data for different periods of time. I use this one all the time for, hey, we had something happen last night at 3 a.m. Oh, okay. Last night at 3 a.m. Well, okay. Well, we'll just do custom and we'll go to, 3 a.m. and we'll see, what was going on at, maybe 3 to 4 a.m. And I could just pipe that in and hit OK. And it's going to say, this is what your top consuming queries were running at 3 a.m. this morning. Again, I also have I can take a look at it in this view. Looks like I was doing some, index maintenance as well. And it looks like I was also running a whole bunch of other queries, doing inserts and stuff like that. So probably had some blocking maybe going on at that point. So it gives me some great insight into what was going on. Do be aware, as we see, we have create indexes and alter indexes and all of that. Those operations are logged as well. So modifying indexes, it might show up as this was your highest logical read. Yeah, it was a really big table, So you kind of just, be aware of that, move on, look at some of the other options that come up in here. See if I can find. I haven't really touched on it yet, but as we take a look over here on this right-hand side, we can take a look at a couple different colors. And what do those mean? Well, this is the same query. The query hash is the same, but the plan is different. It has different shapes. And that's one of the really useful and powerful things of Query Store, is that we are capturing multiple different plans, whereas your plan cache is storing one plan. And at this point, we're able to go ahead and, we can even, select multiple plans and compare them and see what's different. Now, I will tell you, I don't know why. I think I need to reinstall my management studio because my colors here are always, they're just slightly offset. I don't know why. I don't see other people having that, so it's probably just I need to reinstall management studio. But what this will do is this will highlight areas on both plans. You can see, it's kind of weird. But you can see areas that are both plans, and it'll show you, hey, these are different. If we select a specific operator, you'll actually be able to see what's different. So on this one, it was just that it was a different node ID. On this one, and let me go ahead and pin that, it'll tell me that we had different estimated number of rows, and that's why it maybe had a different performance in each of those areas. So the cardinalities were different at the times they were run, so it might also be something that they have different memory grants. And so we can see compiled memory 1888 versus 2048. So yeah, the memory grant was different, which could change your performance. And so that's really useful. You do have the option, if you see any of these plans, oh man, maybe I really like this plan because this was maybe the best performing one. You do have the option to force it. Says, do you want to force it? Yep. And I see these little check boxes, and it says, all right, next time I run it, that's what I'm doing. I'm going to use this execution plan style. And that can be really useful at times, especially if you've just done a 2008 to 2017 upgrade, and you had a regressed query. You can see the old cardinality style here, and it'll be like, oh man, the old one was the 2008 maybe, and then the 2017 was all the way up here. If you force it in the old cardinality, it handles that for you. It won't say, oh, the cardinality estimate's different. It'll go, no, I know what I need to do here. I'll just use that old cardinality estimator and such, and I can force that, which is very helpful when doing upgrades. Man, I would probably only use, I have to have Query Store when I do those upgrades now, just because there's always a query or two that just, goes a little sideways. Once you force plans, you might want to be able to find them. Well, luckily, they have it built in, queries with forced plans, and you can see all different plans that have forced parameters. You do have the option to then over here to be able to unforce the plan. You can do that. It will also tell you if any time you have forced a plan, did it fail? If it fails, there is information as to why. Maybe it was that you can't use that plan because maybe an index that plan used was dropped. Maybe it changed. Maybe an included column that was in there was removed, or maybe there's just there's a variety of different reasons that it can give, and it'll give you a small description here of if it fails to do that. It'll also tell you, the last time when it was forced, when it was run as being forced. So that's very useful. It lets you know the query IDs. You can then look into them, as well as, the different performance options here. And we'll get into why this is a good report to use, because there can be situations where there's going to be a lot of forced plans, especially after 2017. And I'll get into those as well. One of the other reports that I liked is plans that have high variation. Now, my workload was pretty much consistent throughout. I did a couple times where I changed indexes and stuff like that. But if you see, it'll say this option is queries with high variation. And you can do this again on all your different slicers. And, do you have plans that the logical reads change a lot based on different plans? This one is high, low, what's going on? Maybe it's the parameter that's being pushed in. Maybe it's not the parameter. Again, I was just running a big workload. It didn't have a lot of changes to the queries themselves or the parameters, but it was just a big workload going in. And so I do have some data points to say, hey, yeah, we had some variation. And again, do you want the standard deviation? You can look at those. You can change the metric that you're doing those in. Very useful for if you see lots of plans with high variations, and let's say maybe you have a variation that's very low, one very high. It might be something of parameter sniffing. As we continue to look through just some of these other reports, again, I talked about in 2017, we've got the weight stats, and you can see, based on, each of the wait times, do you want the average wait time? This query right here was like all of my parallelism. I have one query that I was just constantly waiting on parallelism. Not necessarily bad, but it was. When you click on any of those, you're like, well, I got to go open it again. There's one button that just appeared. That's this little green one. And we can go back to here. And we can see the network IO, idle, disk, latches, waiting on stuff. And then, where we have each one of them. So we can kind of dig into each one as our weights. Again, wonderfully useful in knowing, oh, hey, we had this one plan. The duration's really off. Well, let's look at it, and we can look at the weights and go, oh, well, this time we were waiting on disk. Okay, well, the disk resource could be really high. And then lastly, we also can just track queries. And I had a few that I think I was writing down, if I just wanted to grab a query ID, and where did I get a query ID? Again, I can grab it from, kind of wherever. There's lots of different areas in here where it'll have the query ID. On any of the other reports, top resource consuming, I can see this query ID here. If I hover over is 47507. So I could just pipe that in. So 47507, and I can hit go. I will say the one thing that's a little frustrating, if I could say something that frustrates me about Query Store, is that when you hit that green button to go, it doesn't tell you that it's running anything. And so you could just sit there and you're like, well, I guess you don't have any information. And that may not be the case. It's probably just retrieving the information from Query Store. It's taking a little while. So that's just what it is. And so you can see like, oh, this query's had, changes over time. We can change the configuration for, what it's been over the last 2 days, the last 4 days and such. It can be really useful in keeping an eye on things. I did want to touch base because I ran into this issue and I was like, why am I having this problem? As you can see, when I hover over this pipe right here, this bar graph, it says query ID, object name. It's pulling that object name from, using the object ID against the system. And so that's the object name that's there. If I drop that object and recreate it, it will get a new object ID, and then that object name will be blank. It'll just not be there. So it is a good, method in 2016 plus if you want to be able to really track stored procedure utilization over time, altering your stored procedures rather than dropping and recreating them, because it does get a little hard at that point to start tracking, hey, I've dropped it, recreated it, for testing a new feature. It doesn't track it all the same then. It's going to get a new query ID, it's going to get a new object ID and a new object name. So you might need to kind of piece some things together if that's the way that your company does things. I don't have an easy way at this point of just putting it all together and say, oh, well, this is what you need to do. There are some ways, but you have to do a little sleuthing. So those are the built-in reports that Query Store has, and there's so much more to go into.